Whatever happens, stay together. This much they had tried for all of their short lives. 8 children, 16 hands, clasped into one chain. Like this, they dashed across the highway or played Ring Around the Rosie, lifting up and crashing down while never letting go. They learned this from their parents, who learned it from their parents. To see Dasani is to see all the places of her life, from the corridors of school to the emergency rooms of hospitals to the crowded vestibules of family court and welfare. Some places are more felt than seen. The place of homelessness, of sisterhood, of a mother-child bond that nothing can break. They dwell within Dasani wherever she goes. The unspoken message is clear. In order to leave poverty, Dasani must also leave her family, at least for a while.
Dasani has seen mansions in the foothills of Staten Island, high above the projects. Her new house, Student Home Sienna, would fit right in. The stone facade structure was designed to be neo-eclectic with farm home elements, a modern and sprawling version of Milton's farmhouse. The McQuitties have house-parented more than 80 children from the streetwise to the rural. They expect Dasani to bring the survival skill set of a city child. She is unafraid of strangers, she can adjust to crowds, she can make quick decisions.
When you leave our house, you need to be able to stand on those 2 feet by yourself. You need to take care of yourself, clean yourself, wash yourself, organize yourself, cook for yourself, keep yourself alive, and be your own person. Then you can go off. It doesn't matter where you go. Even if, God forbid, you dropped out of here, I'd hate for that to happen. But if you did, you would have the skills to survive.
Words have always mattered to Dasani. She also knows that words can hurt. Dasani hates it when people say that actions speak louder, as if words were not an action. It's usually a person's words, in Dasani's experience, that cause a fight. Almost nothing has the power of language. In Dasani, Julie sees a very engaging and outgoing young lady, a girl who wants to be successful and who is highly resilient. In order to survive, Dasani has learned to suppress her feelings, downplaying traumatic events. Julie's goals for Dasani are rooted in the present, to help Dasani build positive peer relationships, resolve conflicts, and achieve academic success.
Dasani is excelling in school with the help of tutors and the daily discipline of homework. She now has 80s on her report card, surpassing all expectations, even her own. She could not believe she has a B in math and A's for conduct and effort. Dasani is now the star. She has even made Hershey's track team. When she finds out, Dasani jumps up and down, screaming and laughing. Still, what she wants most, what is driving her performance at school, is the reward of returning home. Easy victories are the enemy of growth. A child must learn to reach beyond her comfort zone, ignoring immediate urges in the service of a long-term goal. This kind of exchange comes with grit, another buzzword making the rounds at Hershey.
Dasani cannot unplug. She gets signal after signal that her siblings are in distress. All Dasani can do is watch from afar, like a girl who arrives late to the scene of her burning house. None of this would have happened, Dasani thinks, had she remained in New York. The moment she chose Hershey, she chose herself at the expense of her siblings. There is no reminding Dasani that she wept with joy 11 months ago when she got into Hershey. There is no trace today of the girl who wrote in her application essay that she wanted to be away from my family and the distractions of home. Then again, Dasani could not foresee the distractions that came and would keep coming.
The fracturing of Dasani's family follows her back to Hershey. Her grades drop, her language is foul. She is threatening to leave. If she cannot exit voluntarily, she will fight her way out. On December 14th, she goes on Facebook to announce termination coming. Chanel watches this from afar.
Only 2.5 years stand between her daughter and graduation, a blink of a girl's life. Chanel wishes Dasani could see how quickly the time will fly by. Before she knows it, she will be stepping into the cap and gown that none of her matriarchs got to wear. Not her mother, not her grandma Joni, not her great-grandmother Margaret. Dasani would be the first.
But Dasani cannot see past the moment, nor is Dasani swayed by Mr. Akers when he talks his best game. I know you don't want to be hanging with all them drug-dealing boys that ain't got no life and nothing to do but mess with girls' hearts. Every plea falls flat.
The excerpts you just heard tonight were from An Invisible Child, a story of poverty, survival, and hope in an American city. All of my colleagues here tonight you'll find in the pages of that book. And during Dasani's time here, they coached her, they mentored her, and they supported her. While her journey in education did not end here, we all hope that the lessons that were learned and the relationships that were formed are carried with her. And we are thrilled to be here tonight with all of you to have a very important conversation, the conversation of poverty in America. We see every day what it does to children and the side effects of that. So I want to introduce our guests tonight. Andrea Elliott is here, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of An Invisible Child, is joining us to talk about her book. She is joined by another Pulitzer Prize-winning author, MSNBC correspondent and proud graduate, 1996 grad of Milton Hershey School. I would like to introduce Trymaine Lee. Andrea, Trymaine, if you want to come out and have a seat. Thank you. Welcome to Hershey. Welcome home to your home and school, Trymaine. And let's get this important conversation started.
Wow. Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you all for being here. Andrea, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, but it is truly an honor to be here with you at the Milton Hershey School. I spent many years in these seats. I mean, it's all renovated now and looks much different than when I was here. But I can't help but thank you for this conversation, your powerful work. But it's a great excuse for me to be back home, so thank you, Andrea.
It is my great pleasure and also honor and privilege to be here with you, Trymaine. And I just want to thank everyone who just read from excerpts of the book. Every single one of those people entered into Dasani's life and left an imprint that will stay with her for the rest of her days. Of that, I am sure. And it was such an incredible sort of just mind and heart-opening experience to be able to watch them trying to shape Dasani's life after she got here.
So Andrea, you so eloquently and powerfully capture Dasani's ups and downs once she got to the Milton Hershey School. But what's the origin story? How did you first meet Dasani and her family?
Right, because here's the interesting thing about writing about a kid at this school is rarely do we see what happened to them before. So journalists have come and written stories about kids once they're here. I was the sort of rare example of someone who had never actually heard of the Hershey School. I'd come here as a kid to the park, but I was following Dasani for years before she got here, and the way I met her was I was a reporter for the New York Times, and I was trying to find my way into a really big story, which was the story of child poverty in America, an old story, and therefore, to my mind, an especially urgent story. The fact that it doesn't go away, that the fact that 1 in 5 kids was in 2012 growing up poor in America. Now it's about 1 in 7, but we're seeing increasing poverty among children. So with that in mind, I looked in New York, and I wanted to find one kid's story, and I did a lot of interviews and found my way to this homeless shelter in Brooklyn. And I was standing outside the shelter the day that I met Chanel, Dasani's mother, and Dasani and her siblings walking out. That was in October of 2012, and Dasani was 11 years old. And by then, she had been chronically homeless, and she was a kid who did not wear her hardship on her face. She jumped out at me as someone who was filled with joy and mischief. She was tiny for her age and funny and feisty and strong. She was the fastest runner on the block. She could beat all the boys at pull-ups. She was on the honor roll at her local public school. So to my mind, she was like just this magnetic figure that anyone would want to write about. I was mindful not to look for the star because I was trying to stay away from that narrative of the special kid who's in poverty. No, every single kid in poverty deserves attention. But she got my attention. And only after months of immersing with her family was I able to see what her life inside that shelter was really like, and the contrast between all the aspiration that she reflected in her face and in the facts of her life and the reality that she was burdened with, which was that all 10 family members were living in one room, in horrific, decrepit conditions, a city-run shelter managed by an agency with a nearly $1 billion budget, overseen by an administration whose mayor was a billionaire and was finishing his last term. And so the backdrop of the story was inequality in New York, and in the foreground was this kid just trying to learn how to be a kid, how to aspire to what she wanted and follow her dreams, and at the same time survive poverty while surrounded by wealth. And it was in her school, in her public school, where her principal was a very key early mentor of hers. There was where she and I at the same time heard the word Hershey for the first time. She said, I think Dasani needs to apply to this school because there's only so much that a public school can do.
Was there a moment, as a journalist, we have these moments when you realize, I got it, or I heard something, or I see something in an individual you're reporting on that allows them to carry more than just their own story? When did you realize that her story, Dasani's story, and her family story was so much bigger than just this one family from Brooklyn?
Well, that's a really good question because I would say I felt that way from the very beginning. I felt like, okay, this is way bigger than just a story about homelessness. But that was the frame, because you know how it is in a newsroom. You pitch the story, I'm gonna write about a homeless kid. Everybody understands homeless. It's a temporary condition. It's something, it's in the news, it's important. And the problem with that label is that it rests there in what is present and temporary. And rather than really being what I think of it as now, all these years later, which is a signpost directing you into history. It's not just, what I started to do when I spent time kind of unraveling the family's story was I started to see that each label led to another label. So Dasani was homeless because she was poor. Why was she poor? And each question then led me down another path. She was not poor because of bad luck. She was poor, according to her mother, because of the bad luck of her birth, because of the skin color into which she had been born and the zip code in the country with these deep roots of horrific barriers and racism that I then spent years painstakingly trying to report in order to show how, for example, her poverty was rooted in the fact that she didn't have a safety net. We always talk about safety nets, the public safety net, but we rarely talk about the private safety net, which has resulted in white families amassing 10 times the median net wealth of black families. That story is rooted in the 50s. So again, going back from 10,000 feet above the ground to Dasani's story, the microcosm of her story, let's go to her great-grandfather. What happened to him in the 50s? And that just, it's like each layer took me back to another part of history and to something deeper until I ultimately found, with the help of a genealogist, the original sort of white enslaver of her family, and was able to piece together the story, which does reach this pivotal moment in the 50s. Before civil rights, her great-grandfather, who had fought in World War II, who had survived 3 major battles, was a decorated war veteran, had returned to the Jim Crow South after fighting Nazis and fascists abroad, to a country where he, as a black veteran, was denied the same things that white veterans got: loans to buy homes and start businesses, the ability to vote, the ability to go to college. And so he did the best he could, but he wasn't able to create the kind of safety net that as a homeowner you could make for your family that carries forward in generations forward. That was the foundation of this lasting poverty that Dasani inherited. And I think that, so that's a really long answer to your question.
It's a great answer, though.
But this book is about 600 pages long. I've been told it reads really quickly, so I will say that.
If you say so yourself, it's like, it was quick. It's quick read.
I have told, nobody said it. I just met someone who's like, I read it all weekend. 2 people have told me they read it on their honeymoon. That I would not recommend. I take zero responsibility for what the outcome of those marriages.
The most depressing honeymoon ever in life.
This is, but it's intentionally long, even though I believe it does read quickly. What I mean by that is that it is the length of a presidential biography, right? And I believe that Dasani's life is worth every bit as much. And it is as gripping and as interesting and as important a vehicle for understanding history, for understanding policy. And in fact, one of the passages that was read tonight is one of the last passages I wrote, and it comes early on in the book. And you're going to laugh as a journalist at this, but it's because enough journalists who are reading this said to me, you need a nut graph. You need the thing that tells the reader.
That's 101. That's journalism 101. Help us understand what the story is about.
You need to situate the reader in this book. Why are you going to read this book? Why does it matter? And I pushed back. I said, it's obvious why it matters. There's so much that matters here. And eventually, the person who suggested I do this, Jason DeParle, who writes about poverty for the New York Times, he said, think about the Robert Caro books on LBJ, which of course are like a Bible to journalists. There's that passage in the first one, to understand Lyndon Baines Johnson, to understand the character of the 36th President of the United States of America is to understand the character of America. And so as a direct nod to that and the length, I wrote, to know Dasani LaShawn Joni Coates, to follow this one child's life from the first breath she took in a Brooklyn hospital to the full bloom of her adulthood, is to reckon with the story of New York City and beyond its borders with America itself. That is what this book is about.
For many people who will see a poor black girl like Dasani and her family struggling, they see a deficiency of decision making. But here you are casting this much broader in terms of systemic failures, institutional failures.
Absolutely.
Baked in racism, right, in these systems. How have people responded to these notions, especially for those who aren't starting at the baseline, that we're operating in a system that is full of institutional racism and it's not decision making? How have you grappled with that, and how have people responded?
Well, I think people have responded overwhelmingly with the response of outrage to what the book shows. I think it's because, here's the thing about following one person and getting deep inside that one person's story, that one person's family, the rhythms of that one person's life, is that you transport the reader past all the signposts, the issues, the things that are in the abstract, until the reader feels at one with that person, so that as alien as that person's life may seem, the person's problems become your problems too. And then you really start to care. And this happened to me personally as I got to know her. And the more time I spent with this family, the more I came to question the most basic assumptions that people make about poor Black and brown families in particular, but poor white families as well. Ideas that are out there like they don't want to work. They want to live off the government. For example, you spend 3 days with Dasani's family on the streets of New York, and you see between them and everyone around them that they never stop working. It just doesn't look like work in terms of the formal labor market. It might look like bartering. It might look like a hustle. It's survival, and it requires so much innovation. So this idea that they lack personal responsibility is an outrage to my mind. I saw that utterly upended by what I found on the ground with them day after day after day, standing in line at welfare, riding the trains. Just the amount of energy that goes into survival makes it impossible to thrive, I think. I mean, people often talk about poverty as the result of poor choices. I would argue that it is actually the absence of choice. It's the absence of the ability to have agency. And I'd love to see 100 kids, I wouldn't like to see this, but as a thought experiment, 100 kids who are currently at Harvard, let's rewind. They're 5 years old and they're in Dasani's world. And so did those 100 wind up at Harvard and she didn't? No, I don't think so. This is so much a story about the impossible Sisyphean struggle that a kid like her faces. It is an impossible and unjust set of circumstances. And what does it say about our country, right? That you have to, I guess you might want to ask me that question.
But before we get to the heart and the thesis of this.
Not that we haven't really, made any plans here about what we're going to talk about, but yes.
Before we get to the thesis of this book and what it says about who we truly are as America, I wonder, you followed this ambitious, bright little fighter, this little girl here to Milton Hershey School, which for many people would be a ticket out, right? But you also carry with you your traumas, your family history, the stain and residue of what poverty and trauma does to a person. But she comes to Milton Hershey. What happened to Dasani once she got here? Okay,
Dasani came to Milton Hershey at the age of 13, which is a pivotal age. We know this from poverty research. That is an age where it can go in either direction. You know, a lot of things have been cemented in you at that point. Bonds with family, traditions, survival, and the way that your personality is forced to shape around survival, right? Around the act of being able to defend yourself, which is the opposite of vulnerability, for example. These are all things, and when I say that it's interesting that I got to see Dasani before she arrived here, I say that only because when I got here, I saw such an utter transformation. And it was, at first, an extremely positive experience for Dasani. Here's the first thing I noticed about her arrival at Hershey was what it did to her physiologically. It wasn't even about academics at first. It was about the absence of noise. It was about this newfound kind of peace, this different quality of air. It was everything slowed down a beat. And she was able to hear herself think. And she was able to wake up in the morning without worrying about 20 things that she had to worry about in her previous life. From warming the bottle for her baby sister, to were the food stamps gonna come in or not, to was she gonna get in trouble at school because she hadn't finished whatever assignment, and by the way, she was probably gonna miss breakfast as well. A life that was chaotic, that was filled with interruption, and where she was serially displaced actually throughout her life. So the baseline was that. It was unpredictable. And suddenly she was in the opposite. She was in a place that was so predictable. I'm a mom, and I have 2 little kids. At the time, they were really little. And I'd come home, every time I came to Hershey, I'd come home with like notes to myself, like, I need to do a better job with my schedule. Like, I was learning as much as the next person about parenting. Oh my God, I learned so much just watching the McQuitties and the Acres. I mean, wow, like, my kids to this day now greet people differently because I'm like, shake their hand, look them in the eye, and say, hi, my name is. Everyone knows.
But do you put them on restrictions, though?
I mean,
do you put them on restrictions? No
I did
7 to 7, no 14
I put
to
them on
14?
restrictions, absolutely, and they had to learn, you know, and food portions and all of that. But, you know, Dasani had none of that, and suddenly she's here, and she's so excited, and partly because, like, everyone's rooting for her from home as well. Everyone wanted her to make it. And she did it first. She leaped forward 2 math grades, math levels, I should say. She joined the track team, as you guys heard. She was getting A's and B's. She was so excited, and it was a struggle to deal with her family, her first visit home. And I'd like to talk about your time here too, by the way, and if you feel any parallels. But she went home, and the first visit home, she was told she was talking white. And she was really proud of her new folding skills, for example, and she was showing her siblings how to fold, and they were telling her that she was too pushy and she thought she was better than them. And so these early kind of fissures occurred then, but she was still okay. The major thing that happened to Dasani didn't happen here. It happened back home. And it's the way that horrific event where her siblings were removed from their parents on charges of neglect and placed in the foster care system, then rippled back to upend her life here. That's what I think happened. That was the key moment of change for Dasani, was seeing her family break in her absence and then feeling extremely guilty for that. And in fact, I think others in her family would say, and she says herself, she knows if she was there, it wouldn't have happened that way, because she was a central cog in the wheel. So when you remove, and a lot of kids at Hershey come, you know, they tend to be self-starters. They tend to be, among their siblings, maybe the one with the most amount of sort of obvious skills, and they get into this school for those reasons, and for the same reason that they were so useful at home. When you remove them from the home system, other problems occur, and Dasani was old enough at 13 that it was hitting her in a way that it wouldn't have maybe if she was 6, because she would have been maybe more sheltered from the news. But there was no sheltering her. In fact, child protection workers came to the school to tell her what had happened. And of course, the school can't prevent a meeting like that. It's the law, essentially. So the people around her did everything they could. I saw this school throw everything it had at Dasani. I don't know that it would have gone any differently. Honestly, there was nothing more that could have been done. I think she simply couldn't tolerate the survivor's guilt she felt.
Survivor's guilt is an interesting way to frame it. Here she is a world away with resources and people who care about her, a network, a community of people who are rooting for her, but then she's still plugged in back home where the pangs of poverty and the systemic grind of things tugged at her. How did she respond to all of that being here in, tranquil Hershey, Pennsylvania?
I mean, partly it is that material gap. It's the fact that her siblings are in foster homes where 2 were physically abused, and they are calling her and telling her about what's happening, and she gets to be safe, and she gets to have 3 really good meals, not to mention all the snacks that they pass out in the hallways, and the wardrobe, and braces, and swim class, and it's such a contrast, right? And I think for her, it felt like she was choosing herself over them, which is the exact opposite of what she had learned to do as a matter of survival all her life, which is you don't put yourself first. You depend on one another. The family is a system of survival that is the antidote to these systems of control that are monitoring these families. That is where you gain your greatest strength, is in togetherness. Whatever happens, stay together. That was their mantra. And so then she's going to leave them? I mean, it went against everything, every particle of her being. It felt wrong.
And she didn't make it through Milton Hershey School. What was the final straw? What happened?
She got into a fight, and she badly injured another student. And she says she sort of found a way to leave. And I believe that. I mean, she chose to do that. She knew what would happen. She only within 6 months began to regret it hugely. And to this day, I think she wonders, how would her life have been different had she stayed?
If we can Milton Hershey our way out of some of these scenarios, when we are all arriving with pieces missing or maligned or molested, right? And we're coming to a place like this to try to be as whole as possible. If Milton Hershey can't do with all the resources in the $15 or $19 billion endowment, what does that say about the system outside of this ecosystem?
That is exactly the right question to ask. This is the richest private school in America. And if it is freighted with this job, what does it say about America? It says that we have such a weak safety net, that we lack the political willpower to shore up poor kids. Forget about the adults and their personal responsibility. Just think about the fact that at the time that I started this, there were 16 million poor kids in America. There were more than 100,000 homeless children in New York City that year. Actually, in that year was like 60,000, and then it went up. Now it's about 104,000. I mean, what does that say? That we allow people to fall that far. I think it's really an indictment, her story, of the promise of the American dream, the stories that we tell ourselves about meritocracy. This notion that it's entirely up to the individual, the ticket out. There are all these phrases that I began to think about differently as I spent time with her family, to beat the odds. These are the stories that we venerate, that we celebrate, the kids who got out. But what does that say? That is the goal, that is the sort of romantic myth, the departure. Departing from what? We're turning our backs on entire communities when that is the celebrated narrative. And so I think Hershey does what it should be doing, right? Absolutely, in trying to reshape the destiny of the kids at this school. It's less about Hershey and more about what does it say about the rest of America, that we need a place like Hershey in order for that to happen. Why do you have to leave? Why can't this happen? Dasani would like to thrive in place. That would have been the answer for her. And every kid is different, by the way. And there's no silver bullet. I think we could agree on that, right? Yeah. But Dasani now is, she graduated, here's what happened. The major things, and it doesn't give away the book. I don't think this is a book that can be given away because it's not about what happens so much as how it happens. But she, after a long court battle, was reunited with several of her family members, including her mother. That made all the difference in the world. She was able to graduate from her local public high school. She was also able to get stable housing, leave the shelter system. They have these two major variables, family cohesion and the stability of housing. And she was the first in her family to graduate from high school, first in her family to enter community college, and she's now working a stable job. And it's a minimum wage kind of job. She's proud of it. I think she feels that, she's doing the best she can.
I remember when the story first came out in the New York Times, and it was a very big deal in New York City, and we all read it and were moved. Politicians got involved. But I remember one reaction from Michael Bloomberg, the mayor at the time of New York City, who said, you know what, some kids are just dealt a bad hand. He actually invoked God. He said, it's God.
Right.
A bad hand. Are we still grappling with that baseline notion that people's, lot in life is just some bad luck?
I think so. I think that is an easier position to take than to grapple with things like segregated schools, polluted neighborhoods, lack of access to proper health care, lack of access to a living wage or even jobs. The carceral system, the child protection system, those are really big problems that seem almost impossible, and people get overwhelmed. It's a lot easier to focus on the people who are victimized by those problems. And I do not think of Dasani as a victim, by the way. I think of her as a survivor, and that's a key difference.
We've been having this conversation at a pretty high level about systems at work here, right? The machinery and all the little individual nuts and bolts and cogs in it. But from a personal level, as journalists, sometimes we're taught to be a little arm's length with our sources. You spent more than a decade reporting and writing this story with this family. You're learning rap lyrics with them. You're laying on the floor with them. You're there with this family. And I wonder how your relationship has evolved with Dasani and his family, arriving at best, you say a white Latina at best, but still another representation of a lot of things for them. But how has this relationship evolved?
This has been the most complicated and enriching work relationship, I should say, of my life. and relationship, frankly. I mean, I will say that, well, I saw a lot of really upsetting things happen, disturbing things that I wrote about. And while there is a lot to be angry about when you read this book, I really feel that the emotional through line of the book is what I felt when I was in their presence, which was joy. It was this feeling of hope. To just be around them was to feel the promise of them as people. I mean, they were extraordinary people. They were wonderful and rich characters to write about. I used to call them my subjects, and one of them said, if I'm not a character, I don't know who's a character. Definitely don't call me subject, that's too cold. I'm a character. But my job, which had little by way of guidance to begin with, because it's an odd one to immerse for this long, it became really a work in progress for me. I had to figure out the rules as I went and keep reminding them of the rules of our profession, while at the same time noticing the human in me reacting, responding, wishing I could do more when I couldn't, sometimes doing more and writing about it when I did. But what I came to see, and I think this is instructive, I hope, is that rather than the arm's length, which is how I was trained in the traditional kind of newsroom way, that, you know, you wear the hat as the reporter, they wear the hat as the subject, you ask the questions, they answer them, because emotions are scary and they cloud your judgment and they maybe compromise the balance and the objectivity of your work. Therefore, you must remain clear-eyed and rational. All of that kind of just got shoved aside, and what I came to make space for was that both things can be a part of my approach. That I can be as human as I want to feel and also analytical, and that the two share space within me. And that kind of attention to emotion and intimacy elevates the work. It makes it more urgent. It makes people want to read. So did it feel sometimes like I got too close? I mean, sure, and we talked about it when these moments happened. I'll never forget Dasani's little sister, her baby sister Lily. She was 3 years old, and she looked at me as the way the kids just always say the truth. And she said, every time I see you, you in my house. And I was like, I should just put that on my business card. Like, that is the perfect description of what I do. It's so weird. It's like just year after year, just immersing, walking with them. There's this way we talk as journalists, which is we always tell people that we're here, it's a great pitch, because we want to understand, right? I just want to understand. It's a great way in. Who doesn't want to be understood, right? So whether you're trying to interview a press-savvy politician or you're talking to a vulnerable community, that word is usually a good way in. But recently I looked up the root of it because I got tired of hearing myself say it, and it comes from Old English, and it comes from this word understandin', which literally means to stand in the midst of. That's what it means. It doesn't mean we've reached the ultimate truth. It means we have stood. And I think that's what I did more than anything, was to stand in her midst. And the fact of my presence, just the repetition of my presence, the fact that I kept not going away when so many other things had vanished in her life, or she had been a kid by the time I met her at age 11 who had lived maybe at 9 different addresses, who had lost so many people without ever even getting to say goodbye, for whom departures were just a fact of life. She couldn't even say goodbye. The end of our conversations always were, she ended a conversation with the word peace, as her parents did, and greetings. And I learned to say it back. She wouldn't say goodbye. So the idea that I just kept showing up, I think, mattered more than any pitch I could make. I could be talking my best game as a reporter, and it wasn't going to get through. But I want to ask you about your time at Hershey, because
Wait a second, now I'm here for you now. Don't ask any gotcha questions.
My God.
I don't want to get in trouble with Mr. Gert or anybody in here, so don't get me in trouble. So what's the question?
Okay, here's my question. My question for you is, do you think that a kid can come to Hershey, did you see this in your own experience, and endure major trauma and stay here, and why? And what helps them, and what happens there that maybe didn't happen in her mind or her heart?
I think first of all, that's a great question, because again, we are all arriving with the weight of the world, our families, some hurt sometimes and trauma. But I think you have to be in position to, and this is an unfair burden, to see the possibility of wanting more. That there is going to be a separation between you and your family and some of your friends. You're going to go home and you are going to sound different, right? You're going to move a little different. Your expectations of what life could and should be may be a little different. But you have to see that as an opportunity to rescue everyone else, or at least to be a beacon, right? And there's a saying I like, that you make a way where there is no way. And so for some of us, it's uncharted territory. But if you see the opportunities, which is not always easy, because sometimes you can't see the value of it, because if your home life is so fragile, right, and the ground beneath your feet is never steady, you don't understand how to handle what steady is, right? Do you understand what it means to be healthy, and healthy dynamics, and healthy relationships, right? Especially if your worldview is constructed in a very limited way, given all the systems and structures and barriers, right, to access to the freedoms of what America is. We kind of talked about this earlier, but this idea of what freedom is. Have we ever experienced true freedom? Have we experienced health, right? Have we experienced the lack of violence? And not just the physical violence, but the abstract violence of hunger and need and want. So what happens when your belly is full, right? And there is no one crashing in your door. That can be jarring, especially at a young age. But I think we've seen it time and time again. There are, unfortunately, stories that end like Dasani's, even though it ended up happy outside of these walls. But there are many other stories of success. That does not mean it's a perfect institution. This institution is not beyond critique. No institution is. This institution isn't without racism and the kind of the fabric of white supremacy, like the rest of
part of America.
No part of America is,
yeah.
right?
To be able to talk about it is
to
major.
To engage with it and have a community and institution that's malleable enough and fluid enough to add resources, right? So I think it's a great opportunity, but I think we can never underestimate the pressure on human children, small people, right, who are grasping for anything firm. And so it's not easy, but I think there is a way, and we've seen it time and time again. To your point, it's not like everyone has to graduate from the school and go to Harvard, right? But are we moving the ball forward a little bit? And it takes a lot of sacrifice, though, and anyone who graduates from the school knows that you sacrificed a lot to be here. Mm-hmm. You enjoy the milk and the honey, but you are always tethered back home to a lot of people who may not be so fortunate.
One more question, if we're two journalists is a nightmare, because we're just all we want to do is ask each other questions. What do you think, looking back, helped you that you may not have seen was helping you at the time?
I think my biggest fear, even when I was young, I was so excited to come to this school because I got to a certain point in my community where once you start getting to the basketball courts, it's a little trouble a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And even when I was back home, I was in Gifted and Talented when I was young. I was into science, and I was just into all kinds of reading. I was already writing and poetry. I was into this stuff as a kid. And it started to feel like I might be limited, not limited, but I don't know if there'd be anyone to pour into me besides family. And community loved me, but at a certain point, it felt like there was a thing here. And so I think I'm drifting away from your question because I started feeling my way back here.
What actually, this is so great. No, please continue. This is really, really important. The idea that, because sometimes when we're in the middle of something, we're cursing it, we're not liking it, but later on in hindsight, we look back and we say, oh, that person, that coach, that teacher actually had a point, and I see the value of that.
Yeah, well, I had many moments like that here, and Coach Geyer, I know, is in the audience. And I remember one time, and I've said it a number of times now, I remember he said, I don't know if he remembers this, but he said, Trymaine, you're being an underachiever, right? And that hit me because Coach Geyer, we respect Coach Geyer. He's the man here. I loved all my coaches who were my teachers also, but the idea that I wasn't living up to the potential, and I think that was the thing for me, is that there are opportunities to be, I was out here in the airplane club, and I was writing, and Coach Beeler was taking me next door to read some of my stuff, and it was a safe environment to allow myself to blossom. And I think that was just so critically important. And to have, but just as important as those people who, like the Coach Geyers of the world who poured into me, were some of the obstruction. Every house parent isn't the grade A great house parent that cares about poor young black children, especially, right? So navigating those things, and fortunately being able to flex in a way and push back in a way in a safe environment where I knew I had the respect of people in the school and coaches, but I could also challenge folks in a way that was meaningful, right?
Yeah.
As showing other students, no, you can read it in the book too. What he's saying is racist. You could say that. I've never gotten in that much trouble. Never gotten in that much trouble.
You know what's so interesting about the underachiever anecdote you just shared is it reminds me, because to your family, you were a stellar example of stardom in that moment, I'm sure. Like, he's at Hershey, he's playing football, he's doing it, right? And yet to your coach, it was like, no, that's just the baseline. And this is very similar to something that happened with Dasani, where she was on the honor roll and she was sort of acting out, and her principal brought her into the office, and Dasani said, well, I'm on the honor roll. And she goes, yeah, but I want you on the highest end of the honor roll. Okay?
An opportunity to really extend yourself. And that, I think, again, that is the one thing that this school does when it's at its best. Allow you to extend yourself in a way that sometimes there's so much noise and so many dynamics and forces back home that just crunch you, because you're bearing the undue burden of all this stress and what that does to you emotionally and what that does to you physically. And so to be in a space where, again, it is safe enough, right? And people pour into you in a way where it's like the sky is the limit, and that endowment and walking into that clothing room for the first time. Come on.
The clothing center.
Yeah, come on.
I mean, it was like watching Dasani, like, I don't even know how to, I did describe it in the book as Christmas. I mean, it was like the most extraordinary thing I'd ever seen was, actually, she recounted that to me, but it was my tour through it. I felt like it was Christmas for me too. I mean, wow. Yeah.
That was a great experience. I honestly carry Milton Hershey School with me everywhere I go. And so as proud as I am to represent my family, my community, I also represent this community when I'm out there in the world. And so anytime I can engage with anyone and say, you know, there's the school, right? It gave me an opportunity. And again, it's not for everyone because it's not without its issues, right? The machinery always needs to be tinkered with. But it's an honor and a joy and a privilege to be here. And so I'm so glad that you were able to show Dasani's story, though, because as much as there is an opportunity for hope, what can we do better? And it shouldn't be, I happen to believe we're journalists, but I'm speaking personally here.
Yeah.
I don't think it should fall on the shoulders all the time of private communities and private people.
Absolutely not.
Especially when we are tax-paying people. And there are these great promises of what America has always said it is versus what it has been time and again. And so I love that you showed the ups, the downs, and this journey on the back of this little girl's shoulders. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I definitely want to thank Trymaine Lee and Andrea Elliott for this important discussion tonight. Now, we have more questions. We've near the end of our time here, but our senior students are reading Invisible Child in English class.
Wow, thank you.
And a few of them were hoping they could ask you some questions about the book. So if we have our students, feel free to go on up and ask your questions.
Hi, my name is Isabella Pennington. I'm a 12th grader, and I'm from Monalto, PA. And my question to you is, how did following Dasani change your perspective of how an environment can affect the child's development?
I guess what I would say is that I was thinking that her environment was tied into her development from the moment I met her. Because during a very early interview, I asked her to describe the perfect childhood. I have 2 kids. I know what they would say in response to that. It would involve all kinds of toys and gadgets and candy. Dasani, the first word that came out of her mouth was quiet. That was the perfect childhood. And it really moved me. The idea that that was the luxury, that was the thing. And you know, when we think about poverty, we tend to think about it in these really broad brush strokes, like the obvious things: clothing, housing, food. But we don't often think about or know enough about the more subtle textures of it that are just as impactful. And one example of that is noise. It's the impact of noise on her sleep and what interrupted sleep means for educational attainment or even just your mood, and how each thing then leads to another thing that can then snowball into calamity. So I think that, but I could say a lot more, but I'll stop there. Is there anything you would say about environment?
Nothing to say.
Okay, all right.
I don't want to take too much more of your time. We're here for you.
Okay.
Plug, Trymaine does have a book coming out soon, and they have agreed that they're going to come
At some
back?
point. It's,
At
at
some
some point it's
point.
coming.
Let's not.
The B word. We're not going to talk about it. We're going to
Okay.
just,
All right.
we'll get there.
We've got it on the record. Do we have another student?
Hi, my name's Andrew Sapelli. I'm also a 12th grader here, and I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And my question to you was, what was one thing that you learned through following Dasani and her family about education?
I mean, the most clear thing I learned, and this applies to public education more than anything, is that it's basically our biggest anti-poverty program, and unfairly so. That before a teacher like Faith Hester, who's one of the great heroines of this book, can even begin to teach, she is like an ER doctor in triage, handling so many other things, helping to get her kids clothing, food, addressing so many of the problems of poverty in order to even get them to be well enough to focus in class and actually perform well. So schools are freighted with so much of the job that a real safety net would otherwise do. And they're a lifeline. They're a lifeline. For Dasani, that was her second home. It was a provider of meals, a provider of surrogate parenting, the provider of consistency, also obviously at Hershey, but even before that. And I think that just wasn't clear to me. That was the biggest takeaway for me. I was a little actually embarrassed that I didn't understand the extent to which in deeply disadvantaged or even mildly disadvantaged communities, teachers are doing so much more than teaching. I mean, they are carrying the weight of so much injustice and trying to, really, they're on the front lines of the war against poverty in this country.
Hi, my name is Lisa Jones, and I am in 12th grade. I'm from South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And my question to you is, how did being around Dasani's family for so long affect your life at home with your own family?
Oh my goodness. I mean, my girls grew up with this book. They were 1 and 3.5 when it began, and they're now 11 and 14. They have spent a lot of time with Dasani and her siblings, and I think that it was just a huge gift to all of our lives to be in their presence as much as we were. I think I was with them much more than my kids, but there were moments like a Thanksgiving, a birthday. We'd get together sometimes at barbecues in the park. And so the work was really hard, as it is on any family when you are obsessed with what you do, because I think a child has a tendency to feel frustrated by her mother in particular, their mother's attention being elsewhere. I do remember, I mean, I'm sort of debating whether or not to share this, but it was a typical Clara moment, my 11-year-old. This was a few years ago. She said something like, yeah, you know, it's good you called your book Invisible Child, but what about the invisible child right in front of you as you're on your phone?
Wow, shots.
Because I was on Twitter or something. Anyway, it was a true labor of love, and this is what I would like to believe, is that I set an example for my kids of doing something that mattered hugely to me, and I hope for that to them as well. I dedicated the book to them, and I was very deliberate to make it to them and not for them, because I really see it as a letter in a way to them. It is something that they need to learn, as do we all, about some really hard truths about our country.
And just before we conclude, I want to peg off that a little bit, because I feel I was sort of always on the periphery. Andrea would come visit Hershey, and I did see that dynamic, often bringing your daughters along with you as part of the trip and the reporting. And so you said you wanted it to be something for them to understand, almost a charge. So as you're looking at the future and the impact of the book, what has been the impact that you've seen on your daughters and your hope for that relationship with your daughters and going forward in their relationship with Dasani and her family, and how the book has sat with them.
I mean, my daughters are like ready to become social justice warriors at this point. Really, I mean, I think they saw me driving around. This is just a very minor example. A big example, though. For a couple of weeks with, I'm a Prince fanatic. He's my guy. That's my favorite music in the world. It was after I watched the children being ripped apart from their parents in what their parents had described to me for years already as a modern version of slavery, and I started to understand what they meant that day. When child protection workers came in, a system that generates huge profits, and removed these children from their parents to put them in a foster care system that would spend $33,000 a month on those 8 kids when they wouldn't give even a fraction of the money to the parents on charges of neglect due to the conditions of their home. It was so outrageous and so disturbing and also just so deeply, deeply, deeply upsetting. And I tried to shield my kids from that. I figured one day they'll read the book, but they internalized it as, okay, mom is literally driving around with Purple Rain on repeat, and it's been like 3 weeks. It was the only song I could listen to. And every time I listen to it, I tear up thinking about that, but it's like, and there's a lot of music in this book. There's a playlist, it's on my website that I created around all the songs of this book.
Which includes some Biggie Smalls, right?
Yeah.
I know they had you.
Yeah, Give Me the Loot. No, it does not have me, but maybe later at karaoke, you can see.
Yeah, so that dynamic was just fascinating to watch, and it truly was a family affair, both your family and Dasani's family, the Milton Hershey School family. So I just want to thank Trymaine and Andrea once again, if we could give them another round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's great. Thank you. Can I just say, I want to thank you, Lisa, for daring to trust in my work and, staying the path, because there were years and years where you had to stay the path.
It was humbling, and just to be a part of the story. It's such an important story to tell, and we barely scratched the surface. So my hope is that we can continue the dialogue in order to just make America a little more equitable, putting education first, but also equity and survival and joy, truly. That family had joy, but keeping that joy and hope. So Andrea will be available in the rotunda if you'd like to meet Andrea and Trymaine Lee. They'll be out there. Copies of the book will be for sale. Midtown Scholar Bookstore is out there selling copies, and the author will be signing them. So thank you all very much for coming. I want to thank this group. I want to thank our students, and I want to thank our staff, house parents, coaches, teachers across the board who work so hard and invest so much every day in helping children break the cycle of poverty to lead fulfilling and productive lives. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much.